Our topic today is, who is the Antichrist? This is actually a two-part series. So we're just dealing with part one today, and I would invite you to come back in a couple of weeks' time to go through part number two. But who is the Antichrist is our topic for today and of the following fortnight. You know, for centuries, the religious world has been fascinated and fearful as well about the Antichrist. There's been such a lot of speculation relating to the identity of this Antichrist, and it's resulted in a whole range of candidates. You've had everything from Roman emperors way back in the day who were labeled as Antichrist. In particular, Nero. You know, he was responsible for killing countless Christians, and certainly was totally opposed to people worshiping Jesus Christ. So he was labeled in his time as the Antichrist. And then we move all the way through the centuries to our present day. Presidents have been labeled with the same title. CEOs of big tech companies have been called the Antichrist. And so there's this mystical figure, and it's seen as a representative of the devil, actually, a political and religious leader associated with evil and deception. And so this topic that we're going through today, I believe you'll find very, very interesting. You know, Antichrist characters feature in movies, books, and video games. You know, everything from horror to thrillers and to religious films, perhaps especially religious films, you find the character of an Antichrist. So certainly the Antichrist is a source of intrigue and mystery. And there are many Christians who actually believe that the Antichrist will be a political figure at the end of time. And we're going to dive into that in just a few moments. Historically, there have been many people who have tried to prophesy who exactly the Antichrist is. People like Nostradamus, those of you who know history have heard of him. He made a number of prophecies about the Antichrist. He actually predicted that there will be three of them. His followers believe that Napoleon was the first Antichrist, and then Hitler was the second, and then the third, according to his prophecies, Nostradamus' prophecies, is yet to come. So you've got this wide range of views. And with that, so how can we actually accurately identify the Antichrist? Well, what we normally do in our sessions together in these presentations is we ask a number of questions, and we always go to the Bible to find the answers. So we're going to consider some general themes like, is the Antichrist an individual or an alliance of evil? And while we're thinking of that, will the Antichrist appear in the future, or is he alive today? And while we're thinking of that, why not consider what role will the Antichrist play in the final events of history? And I would suggest always think about, well, not always, but also consider about how can you be certain to avoid the sinister plans of the deceptive power. So as I mentioned, let's go to a number of questions and seek those answers directly from the Bible. Question number one, what does the Bible say about the Antichrist? 2 John chapter 1, verse 7 gives us a good answer. For many deceivers have gone out into the world who do not confess Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh. This is a deceiver and an Antichrist. Let me break that down a little bit. So there'll be people who'll be going out in the world not confessing that Jesus Christ will come in the flesh. That kind of teaching is deception, and it is the personality trait of an Antichrist. So you could think of, in summary, as an Antichrist as someone who is a false teacher or a deceptive power that corrupts the faith within the church. You know, the term Antichrist is only mentioned in 4 passages throughout the Bible, but those 4 passages are consistent with each other. Each of them use the term to portray a false teacher. So you have this Antichrist, which literally means instead of Christ, or another way to say it, in place of Christ. You'll know from Isaiah 14 that the original Antichrist is the devil himself. It was Lucifer who's first wanted to take the place of Christ. And it is he who continually opposes and misrepresents Christ. And so, as I've said, Antichrist literally means instead of Christ or in place of Christ. So let's have a look at the Antichrist of prophecy. Within the Bible, there is one specific Antichrist who is described in a lot of detail. And as I mentioned, we're looking at the first part of that in this two-part presentation. This presentation covers a tremendous amount of information, which is why I've had to break it into two parts, but I'm aiming to present the key points today, because there's just no time to go over everything in one sitting. So I've made two basic assumptions in putting this together in regards to perhaps your general knowledge as a viewer. The first one being that you may have some idea of world religious history. And the second assumption is you are at least familiar with or have heard of Daniel and Revelation in the Bible. And you may have picked up, little bits of information here and there. So if you've got at least those two, if I'm correct in those two assumptions, then hopefully you should have the ability to grasp what's been presented today. So we know that from biblical prophecy, the religious extra biblical history, that this power would rise after the time of the early church. And I'm talking way, way back, centuries back when I say early church. So it would arise after that time, that is after the New Testament church, so way after Jesus' time, but it would have a dramatic impact on the history of the world. So let's ask another question then. What is the name of the Antichrist that would arise after the time of the early church? 2 Thessalonians 2. Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, as he's referred to. And perdition, another word for that is doomed. You're doomed to destruction. So let me just break this text down a little bit more. This is Paul. He's writing a letter to the people of Thessalonica because he has heard that some people believe and actually teach that Jesus would actually return in their day. So the Apostle Paul is just totally refuting this. And he's saying to them, look, he's predicting that before Jesus returns, the church would experience a major spiritual fall. And so that's the falling away that he's referring to in this text that you see on your screen. So this falling away would actually provide time to reveal who this man of sin is, this great Antichrist who would actually exalt himself and be involved in breaking and disregarding God's law. And so most people think that the Antichrist will be a secular political leader, but you're going to find out that the Bible is really clear. The Antichrist actually comes from within the world of religion. Let me rephrase it this way. The Antichrist of prophecy will actually arise from within the church. That's a little bit, how should I say, uncomfortable to hear. When I say the church, I mean Christendom worldwide. So in a similar way, to just give you an example here, Jesus referred to his disciple Judas. You remember Judas, the guy that betrayed Jesus? He actually referred to Judas as the son of perdition. There's that word again, perdition, right? You can find that in John chapter 7, verse 12. So he refers to Judas in this way. Judas, here's the thing, Judas was one of the disciples. In other words, he was one of the leaders of the early church, but he wanted power more than he wanted Christ. And remember what we learned in our first question about the character of an Antichrist? It's someone who is a false teacher, someone who's working through deception. Judas deceived his own co-leaders, the other disciples. So this Antichrist arises from within the church. So we're going to delve into Daniel chapter 7 mainly today. Most of the prophecies relating to the Antichrist are featured in Daniel and Revelation. So in these prophecies, there are a variety of symbols that are used to describe the characteristics and the activities of this Antichrist. there's an interesting interplay between Daniel and Revelation. For example, in the book of Daniel, you have the Antichrist power symbolized as a little horn. You find that in Daniel 7. Now, this little horn is spoken of in a different way in the book of Revelation. It's the same power being described, but the term being used by the author of Revelation, which is John, he calls it the first beast, or even Babylon further on. But in each case, the identifying marks are very similar. That is, they're indicating the same power, just presented in a slightly different angle. And so in Daniel 7, the Antichrist of prophecy, it's described with a vision of 4 beasts. We have these 4 very different beasts, and we're going to have a look at those now. So question 3, what did Daniel see coming up from the wind-swept sea? Daniel 7, verse 2 and 3, Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and 4 great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. So in this vision, Daniel is seeing these 4 great animals coming up from the sea. Each of these beasts are different with unique characteristics. Now, at this point, I think it'd be useful to understand something about biblical symbols or imagery, and that is in terms of how they relate to prophecy. So let's ask the question then, in Bible prophecy, what do the following symbols represent? So Daniel has mentioned certain symbols, images. So let's have a look at those. He mentioned the wind. Well, what does that mean? Well, in Bible prophecy, it means strife, destruction, even war. You'll find that in the text that we just read in Daniel 7 verses 2 and 3, that it spoke of wind. And elsewhere in the Bible, it gives us clues as to what wind represents. For example, Jeremiah 49, it says, against Elam, I will bring the 4 winds. There's that word. I will bring disaster. So it's making a connection between wind and disaster. Upon them, my fierce anger, says the Lord, and I will send the sword after them until I have consumed them. So here's this imagery of destruction, that is the sword, right? So you've got this you can see that the wind is about corruption and destruction, immense commotion, if you like. It brings destruction like a sword will. Now, the second imagery that Daniel used was the sea. Now, that means many people, a vast population, a place where there are many people from a wide background of nationalities. So even today, we have this expression that we use when there's a lot of people in a big group. We say, wow, there was a sea of faces. So here's this imagery that Daniel is using. The beasts in Daniel's vision were coming up from very populated areas of the globe. And we can see in Revelation backs that up. Revelation 17 verse 15 says, then he said to me, the waters which you saw are peoples, plural, multitudes, plural, nations and tongues or languages. So it's clear, the sea that Daniel uses in vision represents a large population of people. Now, he also uses the imagery of beasts, right? And a beast represents a kingdom, a political power. So this is important to understand because many people believe that the Antichrist will comprise of an individual only, just one person. That's the Antichrist. That's what they believe. There's a story that I can share of when I was looking after a church plant in a little place called Meremere, which is just south of the Bombay Hills of Auckland. There was a community of believers there, of Christian believers, who actually thought there was a little old lady who lived down the end of one of the streets. They actually referred to her as the Antichrist, and they were convicted of that. They weren't being facetious or anything like that. They thought from their reading of Bible prophecy that this person was the Antichrist. Look, family, as we go through this teaching, you will discover that the Antichrist is not one person solely. The Antichrist is a bit more than just that. The Antichrist, or the beast rather, represents a kingdom, a political power that utilizes, and we're going to discover this shortly, it utilizes sinister power of deception and eventually force. So in Daniel chapter 7, verse 17, it says, those great beasts which are four kings. There you go. Do we have kings today? No, but kings represented what? Kingdoms, right? And it continues to say that the fourth beast shall be the fourth kingdom on earth. So in other words, nations is what it's representing. These beasts represent a nation. You know, it's similar today. We still have animals that represent the nations of the world. If you were to think of the golden or the bald eagle, you would normally associate that with the United States of America. If you were to think of a kangaroo, you wouldn't immediately associate that with Spain. You would know that it connects with Australia. And to bring that home even more closely, the humble little kiwi we know relates to Aotearoa, New Zealand. And so we find in Daniel 7, four great nations or political powers, all different from one another. They're rising up from populated areas of the world where there has been a history of war and destruction. And by comparing the prophecy of Daniel 2, those of you who remember the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had of that big statue, let me see if I can find a picture for you, just to remind those who may not quite remember that, the picture of the statue, there it is. Here's the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, the king. He dreamt of this big statue. No one could interpret the dream except for Daniel, because of God interpreted the dream through Daniel. And so Daniel interpreted the dream, and we see the statue of the head of gold, and the chest of silver, and the thighs of bronze, and the legs of iron, and the feet of iron and clay. And so to go back to our screen there, if we compare that prophecy, that dream, with the prophecy of Daniel 7, which is what we're talking about today, the four beasts, it's evident then that Daniel is seeing the same succession of world empires. In other words, he's seeing the same message with different imagery. Let me see if I can illustrate the link again between these two prophecies. So in Daniel 7, you have what's referred to as the fourth kingdom, or it's the fourth beast. And it has iron teeth, and we'll get to that in a second. I'm just jumping ahead a little bit. It has iron teeth, and it's called the fourth kingdom, right? We get that from Daniel 7:23. Now, the power represented by iron in Daniel 2, that's that image I just showed you before. Let me bring that up again. The power that's represented in this image here, the fourth kingdom, so count from the head down. The head is 1, the chest is 2, the thighs are 3, and the legs are 4. So that's the fourth kingdom. Guess what they're made of? You got it. They're made of iron, just like the fourth beast has iron teeth. So Daniel is seeing the same message with different imagery. What beast is used to symbolize the first kingdom, which is Babylon? So we're going to look at these kingdoms now, folks. So in Daniel chapter 7, verse 4, it tells us that the first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Wow, what kind of animal is that? A lion with eagle's wings. The king of beasts is a perfect symbol for the proud and powerful Babylon, and an ideal parallel to the head of gold in Daniel 2. You know, when you think of a group of lions together, what are they called? Yes, a pride of lions. So here you have this lion, very majestic animal, with wings though. We don't usually see that. You know, in the ancient, how do we say, the archaeological remains of Babylon, they found these beautiful engravings on the wall of Babylon. These winged lions, exactly as described in the prophecy. So a winged lion, it's our first descriptor for Babylon. That's our first beast that Daniel sees in his dream. What animal is used to represent the second kingdom? That's Medo-Persia. We find in Daniel chapter 7, verse 5. And suddenly another beast, a second, like a bear, it was raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. So this bear looks a little bit lopsided, right? And that's because the coalition government of the Medes and the Persians were actually lopsided in the sense that the Persians were far stronger a far stronger entity than the Medes. Now we've got this bear that's got 3 ribs in its mouth. What on earth does that mean? Well, it's an indication that it's actually eaten other beasts. And we know that beasts represent nations. So what it's saying is the 3 major powers have been conquered by Medo-Persia. Well, who are those 3 powers? Well, history shows us and proves that Medo-Persia actually conquered Babylon, Lydia, and Egypt. Now remember, folks, Daniel is writing this way ahead, way ahead of his time, thousands of years before it even happens. And history has proven to the T that Daniel's visions were correct. Question number 7, what animal is used to represent the 3rd kingdom, which is Greece? Daniel 7 verse 6 tells us, after this I looked, and there was another, like a leopard, which had on his back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Wow, a leopard with 4 heads, really? A leopard with 4 wings? Well, it represents a very fast and attacking empire. And as you notice, there are 4 heads, as mentioned. Now, after the death of Alexander the Great, those of you who know your history, Alexander the Great, when he died, the Greek Empire was divided between his 4 generals. That is, the heads of his empire. Did you get my emphasis there on the word heads? 4 heads are seen in this leopard. Leopards are fast animals, represented by the wings as well, emphasized more by the wings. Greece was a fast, swift-moving empire that overtook many. And when it came to the time of Alexander the Great's death, this empire was divided into 4 areas. Wow, that's something. Again, Daniel is writing this thousands of years ahead of his time. Question 8, the 4th kingdom, pagan Rome, is symbolized by a powerful creature with iron teeth. This is what we were talking about before. And the 10 horns. What do these 10 horns represent? Daniel 7:24 tells us that the 10 horns are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom. So just as the iron legs of Rome divided into the iron and clay of the 10 toes, that's that image that we had to look at before, the big statue, right down the bottom were the toes, the feet. So there were 10 toes. Just as that image was given and that was divided into 10 toes, we now find Daniel seeing 10 horns arising out of the power of Rome. And these nations are what we see today as Western Europe. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit more later. But question 9, what did Daniel see coming up out of the 10 horns? All right, so Daniel 7 verse 8 tells us, I was considering the horns. That is, he was really pondering or really thinking this through. And there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. Wow, so here's this little horn that appears up out of from amongst the other 10 horns. All right, so I would at this stage encourage you to note down Daniel chapter 7, specifically verses 8 through to 28, because we're going to explore that now. But I'd love for you to do this yourself so that you can make sure that your pastor is not just making this stuff up. So look into those texts and get some clues. So again, the little horn and the judgment is basically the focus for the rest of this chapter, that is Daniel 7. And so it is the power that provides the additional information to Daniel 2. That is the imagery, the statue that we looked at. So Daniel 7 expands more on Daniel 2, on that prophecy in Daniel 2. And here we will see that the character and the power of this little horn, this great Antichrist of prophecy. So let's look at some clues. We're going to go through 10 clues before we wrap this up. Our first clue is it arises from Western Europe. All right. So again, we're asking the question is, what are the characteristics that clearly identify the Antichrist power of the little horn? Our first clue is it arises from Western Europe. You know, the little horn was seen in amongst the 10 horns, right? Daniel says coming up from them. Since the 10 horns represent the division of the Roman Empire into the nations of Western Europe, the little horn would arise from somewhere within that region, somewhere within Western Europe, that we call it Western Europe today. It wasn't always referred to in that way. So like a jigsaw puzzle, let's start looking at some of the clues and put this together. So that's our first clue. It arises from Western Europe. Our second clue is that it is, Daniel calls it a little kingdom. So we have this political power that has a unique characteristic of being a little horn. We find here that we have a small nation that will accomplish large things. So our second clue then is it's a little kingdom. Our third clue, it arises after the 10 tribes of Europe were established. So we've sort of touched on that. Alexander the Great has now deceased, and his empire is divided into 10. So there's the names of these countries here. They're not named that anymore. You would see Anglo-Saxons in the top left-hand corner of your screen. Anglo-Saxons today is Great Britain, all right, England. Franks, well, that's France. The Helui, that is Italy, and all these other countries you can see. So they are now what we call Western Europe. So the little horn Antichrist comes to power after these 10 horns are established, these nations you're looking at now on the screen, after they are established, and another shall rise after them. All right, that's Daniel 7:24. So the 10 horns were finally established. These nations you're looking at were finally established in the year 476 AD. So we're actually looking for a power which gained its political clout after this date. All right, so that's our third clue. It arises after the 10 tribes of Europe were established. Clue number 4, it overcomes, this little horn overcomes 3 political powers as it rose to prominence. Wow, okay, so the Bible says that 3 of the original 10 horns were plucked out by the roots. That's the way that Daniel phrases it. The little horn would overcome 3 of the tribes of Europe on its way to dominance. Remember the bear with the 3 ribs in its mouth? 3 of the original kingdoms had been removed by 538 AD, history shows. This kingdom would come to power sometime around that date, sometime around 530 AD. This gets more and more interesting, especially with history verifying this. So there's our other clue. It overcomes 3 political powers as it rises to prominence. Clue number 5, it is different from the other 10 powers. You see, the 10 powers of Western Europe that we call it today were all secular political powers. But this little horn that Daniel calls it is unique. There's something different about this power. So that's our next clue. This is just different from the other 10 powers. Clue number 6, it would have a man at its head who speaks for it. You know, although this power is a political entity, it would have eyes like the eyes of a man, that Daniel says. A man would actually be the focus of this power and would be the absolute spokesperson of that power. Wow, this is this is getting very interesting. So there's our other clue. It would have a man as its head and it would speak for it. Clue number 7, this entity would speak blasphemies against God. This power delves into religion. It's speaking, as Daniel says, pompous words against the Most High. In other words, this entity, this little horn, this power would speak against what God has said. So there's our other clue. It would speak blasphemies against God. Clue number 8, it would persecute God's people. You know, the little horn power would persecute the saints of the Most High, is the way that David puts it. So we are looking for a power who is responsible for the deaths of many, many, many faithful Christians over the years, the decades, the centuries. That's our other clue. it would persecute God's people. Clue number 9. I need you to tune into this one because it takes a little bit of understanding if you're not used to the way that prophecy renders time. It would be in power for 1,260 years. I'm not sure if you can see clearly on your screen, but you'll see the biblical references there. You've got Daniel 7:25, Daniel 12:7, and then all the rest is in Revelation. They give you some indication on how to render time in a prophetical sense. So let me break it down a little bit here. This power rules for, Daniel says, a time and times and half a time. Let me just pause there. A time and times and half a time. Let me explain. A time is basically 1 year. I might be jumping ahead here, but let me just explain if I can. So if a time is 1 year, then times, plural, is 2 years. And if a time is 1 year, then half a time, right, half of 12 months is 6 months. So you get a time, which is 1 year, plus times, which is 2 years, so that's 3 years, plus half a time, which is 6 months, so you get 3.5 years. That's how you render time in the prophecy of Daniel. So, as it says on your screen, by comparing Daniel 7, verse 25 with Revelation 12, verse 6 and 14, again, I encourage you to look up those verses. When you compare the two together, you will see that it's clear that this time prophecy is another way of simply saying 1,260 days, which, by the way, as you've just learned, a day is 1 year. So what it's saying, 1,260 days is 1,260 years. Again, just to re-emphasize, in Bible prophecy, a day is a symbolic code for a literal year. You get that from Ezekiel 4:6. So you get 1,260 days actually represents 1,260 literal years. 7 times in the books of Daniel and Revelation, the same time period is given, using different phrases to represent the length of rule for this Antichrist power. So there is our other clue. Also, our last clue is this power would attempt to change times and law. For those of you who could be with us a couple of weeks ago, when we talked about the mark of the beast, you've already got the answer to this. But I just encourage you just to hold on to that and look forward to the next presentation, part 2 of this, in a couple of weeks' time. But to just elaborate on this, in one of the most intriguing clues of all, the little horn would intend to change times and law. And Daniel tells us that in chapter 7, verse 25. So in our search for the identity of the Antichrist, we need to discover which power would attempt to alter times in connection with law. And here are all the clues that we've just walked through and articulated. And I'm just looking forward to our next session, our next presentation, part 2, that will help us identify exactly who the Antichrist of Bible prophecy is. But before wrapping up, I just want to summarize with 3 simple points for you to remember in today's presentation. The first one being simply, an Antichrist, quote unquote, is a person or entity that opposes or attempts to take the place of Jesus Christ. Our second point in summary, the Antichrist of prophecy is called the man of sin, as you saw in the Bible text. And lastly, Daniel 7 provides at least 10 clear clues that you've just walked through that help us identify the Antichrist of prophecy. So please join in a couple of weeks' time for the second part of this Antichrist presentation. Until then, God bless you mightily.